Now we're going back to square one, making fire.
I suppose if I watch a particular clip more than 3 times or a number of times, I would want something else because eventually you get bored. That might not stimulate you as much as it did when you watched it the first couple of times.
Precisely. Precisely. Well, I mean, too, like, I've certainly noticed from having spoken to a few parents about their kids, stuff like they can't concentrate at school. I think there can be problems with sleep disturbance. There's many consequences. I think too, the other problem is they start to develop this very powerful fantasy world. Again, when you look at people who develop a problem with pornography, like I've mentioned, pornography and masturbation just go hand in hand. They are literally it's like bread and butter.
Yeah.
So what I would actually say to a pornography addict is you've also got to stop masturbating as well.
Welcome to Beyond the Headlines with me, Dr. Q. Please feel free to call me Q for the next hour. Is it okay if I call you Charlie?
Absolutely, that'd be great. Thanks.
Okay. Charlie, I want to know, before we even start, why do you do the work that you do?
To be frank with you, the reason why I do the work that I do is because I've had my own checkered history with addiction. Okay. Now, I originally came to this country back in April 2006 because I had a major problem with drugs, alcohol, and sex addiction. And sex addiction, it's almost like pornography addiction is kind of like a subset of sex addiction. In many ways, it's online sex addiction. It still involves compulsive behavior, viewing of sexual activity on a screen, and obviously masturbating to it is provided there's a compulsive pattern of doing it over many years. To my mind, constitutes what we're talking about when we talk about pornography addiction. So I came here in April 2006 for my own treatment and addiction, and eventually ended up settling down here. And really, back in those days, sex addiction was just a twinkling in people's eye. It was something that was being mentioned, it was being talked about, but on a very minimal level.
So, how old were you at the time?
I was 32.
32. So why South Africa? Why did you come to South Africa? And from where were you?
I am from the UK, but at that stage I was living in South America, working out there as a tour leader for an English company. And I was fast losing control of my life in South America. And I happened to bump into a school friend when I came, ironically, to South Africa in November 2005. And he told me the best person to see was this gentleman in Harley Street in London, who I went to go and see. He then told me that the best place for treatment, ironically, was where I'd just come from, South Africa.
Oh.
Cape Town, yeah. So I went out to South America again for about 4 or 5 months, and everything he predicted came true. Things got much worse because, you see, addiction is a progressive illness.
Yeah.
It escalates over many years. It gets worse if it gets untreated. And it just got infinitely worse to the point where I just called him and said, I can't do this anymore.
Yeah.
I need help. And that's a big struggle for an addict because we're in denial that we have a problem, you see. Addiction is characterized by a denial system where we justify, minimize, or rationalize or manipulate in various ways to convince ourselves that we don't really have a problem when all the evidence is there that we do.
Yeah. And you said there's many different layers of you said pornography falls in the sex category. I think that's how you phrased it. So I'm assuming there's different layers of such addictions. what was your addiction in particular? Was it watching porn or was it something else?
It was basically my sort of key struggle or problem in terms of addictive behavior was drinking alcohol.
Okay.
Firstly, yeah, and then once I drank alcohol, I convinced myself that I then wanted to use drugs. So I'd look for cocaine, namely cocaine, and then I'd go and act out sexually with women. Yeah.
Okay.
And that became a pattern and a repeated pattern and more of a problem. Yeah.
And what would happen in instances where you couldn't find a woman?
Well, to be frank with you, and I guess this is me being more vulnerable and honest, yeah, because when we confront addiction, we have to learn to be brutally honest with ourselves. Actually, what I would do was I would go and procure sex workers. So sex workers and drugs very much became very much my two drugs of choice, along with pornography too. So it's a very vicious and unpleasant and destructive, toxic mix. Yeah. Like I said, the problem is it gets worse. Addiction gets worse if you've got the problem with clear signs of what we call escalation or progression, and that's one of the key ways in which you diagnose addiction. It's a little bit like Dr. Q. When it comes to pornography, two of the most important questions I will ask a pornography addict is, firstly, are you spending more amounts of time online looking at the same material? Or are you finding that you're looking at more and more extreme genres of pornography?
Yeah.
Because
what would qualify as extreme genres?
Well, we're talking about it could potentially be stuff that because very often when you start out as a porn addict, certain genres of sex or of pornography might be certainly deemed to you to be absolutely disgusting and awful, and you never look at them. Yeah, but this is the problem with pornography, is that. And I think this is something that's characterized a lot of people who have a problem with addiction, is they're driven a lot by a need for excitement, and they're driven a lot by a deep sense of curiosity. Oh, what's this? Let me look at this. This is not very nice. I didn't really want to look at that. But then it kind of, what I find is sometimes it can actually pique their interest and they go back to it. So they could start looking at stuff like certainly BDSM. I mean, there are so many different genres.
What's BDSM?
That's got a lot to do with pain exchange sex and certainly sadomasochism. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's got to do with sexual arousal being based on pain, for example. Yeah. But again, what we're looking for here is an obsessive relationship with pornography. I think there's a lot of people who look at porn and they may say to themselves, well, it doesn't matter because everybody's looking at porn. But the key question I always ask my patients at Dr. Q is how much porn do you look at?
Yeah.
And invariably that requires an honest answer too, because we don't want to admit that we've got a problem. So different genres could be stuff going even into shemale. It could even be squirting. It could even be face shots. It's like there's no limits really to the kind of pornography that people will seek out and start looking at, because it gives them certainly an arousal and a thrill. And the problem is this thing that we call internet pornography doesn't come with a warning label like cigarettes does or alcohol, doesn't come with an age restriction. And that's why I even get some parents, inquiring and saying to me that their children have discovered pornography. They've even been looking at it for years, some of them. And they're 10, 11, 13, And the problem is really by then they're the beginnings of their sexual arousal template as human beings is starting to be developed. You've also got to remember that teenagers their brains are developing in many facets of life. One of those is sexually. So unfortunately, pornography can certainly put a very destructive imprint on a teenager's mind in terms of their concept of sex.
While you're there, I was reading this article just yesterday. It was published by this lady. She's a professor at Stellenbosch University. And in her findings, she found that when teenagers watch too much pornography, they sort of like catalyze the process. I don't know what you call it, but instead of things happening organically, they are now self-induced.
Right.
And that works against them.
Completely.
Can you expand on that, please?
Well, that makes sense to me because let me explain some concepts about pornography. Something that they've seen is that pornography really appeals to a concept that we call supernormal stimuli. Okay, now supernormal stimuli means that the exaggerated version gives a greater pull or hit than the real thing. So that basically means that, for example, looking at pornography becomes far more exciting. That's the exaggerated version than the real thing, me actually being sexual with another human being. Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense when you think about it, because when you look at certainly the porn models in pornography, very often they might have had some kind of surgery enhancement, breast enlargement. The men have enormous penises, and the whole thing in many ways is a highly stimulating exaggeration, shall we say, exaggerated version of what sex perhaps might be, shall we say, on a more healthy level, where one is actually making love to somebody and perhaps there's eye contact and it's an actual emotional experience as opposed to a sexual fix. You know? So, I mean, I think that's important to bear in mind. I think what they've also seen too, certainly, is that that pornography completely plays with dopamine levels. What they've seen certainly is that dopamine surges with sexual novelty. Of course, where can you find the most sexual novelty in the world? On the internet. That's what keeps people looking at porn for hours, is each new clip gives a hit of dopamine. So if you have 25 tabs across your screen, you're going to get 25 hits of dopamine, and you might keep looking for more. But invariably, as porn addicts, we're looking for the perfect clip that literally meets the fantasy in our mind. And that's an important concept, actually, certainly Dr. Q, is that what drives or generates certainly pornography addiction is this very powerful, intense, obsessive fantasy world. And what they've seen too is there's a feedback loop between fantasy and porn. So once I start looking at porn, it generates a lot of fantasy. And then once I'm fantasizing, I want to go back to the porn.
Yeah.
So it creates this very powerful feedback loop of fantasy porn, fantasy porn, fantasy porn. And because it's a progressive illness, like I've certainly mentioned about addiction, certain clips or genres just might not do it anymore. So now, because we want a bigger hit, we'll keep looking for new genres or new clips.
I suppose if I watch a particular clip more than 3 times or when a number of times, I would want something else, because eventually you get bored. That might not stimulate you as much as it did when you watched it the first couple of times.
Precisely.
Right? So,
Precisely.
what is sex? And we've got this idea of what sex is, but I've listened to a number of podcasts actually, and I would get experts explaining, and you touched on it a bit, explaining what sex isn't. And one of the examples that they make is when we watch pornography, for instance, we see all these ridiculous positions that people do, and we see these gigantic organs. You made an example. Can you tell me more about that?
Just in terms of what my perception of sex is.
Yes.
Well, I think, it's like, again, I can tell you certainly what unhealthy sex is, and perhaps I can provide some insight as to what healthy sex is. I think certainly unhealthy sex has a lot to do with anything that leaves you feeling guilty or ashamed. Yeah. And unfortunately, life experiences, when you actually look at sex addiction, for example, there's this guy in the States called Patrick Carnes, who was the first guy to term the word or the clinical description sex addiction. Yeah. And he did studies over many years, and he basically came up with figures that 98% of sex addicts have been emotionally abused. I think it's 84% have been sexually abused, and 76 have been physically abused. So people that develop a problem with this kind of problem sex addiction, there's normally a lot of trauma. Yeah. And sexual trauma is bad news for one's relationship with sex. Yeah. Because it can make it very problematic and very difficult, But I think certainly unhealthy sex has a lot to do with potentially unconsciously replaying out your traumas without even knowing that you're doing it. A lot to do with shame, a lot to do with guilt. And sometimes it can obviously be abusive, certainly be abusive if it's used as a power tool, for example, for exploitation or manipulation. But I think healthy sex, in many ways, is kind of a byproduct of a strong emotional connection as a couple. So it's almost like it's an extension, or it flows from a loving, romantic connection that a couple has. Yeah. And it's something I think that certainly a couple is able to sustain. Now, that's not easy at all. Yeah. I think it's difficult for couples in this day and age to sustain their sexually intimate relationship. Yeah. But I think it has a lot to do with a very deep mutual respect for each other, and also in many ways a desire to please and to pleasure your partner first and foremost before your own pleasure.
Yeah.
I think that's important,
And do sizes matter? You mentioned size. Do those things matter, and should they matter?
Do you know what? It's actually very interesting you say that, because a lot of sexually addicted men that I have treated, very often there's been an issue around sexual dysfunction with them that has kind of coupled the sex addiction. And quite a few of them have expressed that they have had massive hang-ups with their size. Yeah? Now, what's interesting is from conversations I've had with other people, I can't say for certain this applies to everyone, Dr. Q, but I'm not exactly convinced that size matters that much to women. Yes, it might to some, or to a few, yeah? But I'm not convinced that that's necessarily the major issue for all women. Yeah? It might be an issue for some, yeah? But I think what I think certainly men and women want is a connection, an emotional connection that is expressed sexually, through intimacy, through intimate contact. Yeah. So I mean, this is the problem. Is like porn shows us size matters. The bigger, the better. Mm-hmm. But is that a real depiction of reality in the real world?
Yeah.
Is it?
I don't think so.
It's not, is it? That's why I spoke about supernormal stimuli. Yeah. And how, for me, in many ways, pornography is the epitome of supernormal stimuli, because literally the exaggerated version of porn gives a far greater hit than the real thing. These poor women, and I say this to every woman that I meet, that who's a partner of a pornography addict that I treat, I always say to them, there's no woman on this planet that can compete with porn.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how beautiful or attractive that partner is. Yeah, we're literally up against something so powerful neuroscientifically in the brain, in terms of how it just delivers this seismic dopamine hit. Yeah, that women can't compete with. Poor things, But that's why, in many ways, pornography. It's a big problem. I believe it's a worldwide epidemic.
Yeah,
and I'm very worried about what it's doing to our kids. And especially the generation in this country since 2007, because that was when we got broadband in this country. And it's very notable, Dr. Q, with my patients, many of them reported that their pornography addiction escalated from 2007 when we got broadband.
Damn. Wow. That's very interesting because I ran a poll on social media. I was asking people about masturbation and pornography. And one of the questions was if they watch porn while they masturbate. And 75% of them, 66.7% of them said yes, they do. They can't masturbate without watching anything. So I find that to be very true. And I guess if we round this off, we would even say 95% of them said yes, because some of them said sometimes they watch.
That's a very high proportion, and I think you're alluding to something actually very poignant, because when you look at my patients when they struggle with pornography addiction, it's almost like masturbation for the vast majority of them. And again, I can't say all of them, but the vast majority of them, it's this extremely lethal marriage of pornography and masturbation. It's almost like you wouldn't do one without the other. It's literally like bread and butter or Siamese twins. It has to go together. In fact, actually, one of the questions that certainly I've asked patients in the past is that when you look at pornography, would you say that 80% of the time you masturbate with pornography or without? And when you look at porn addicts, a very, very high proportion of them will say, I wouldn't do one without the other. So yeah, it seems to be for the vast majority of the time that that is the case.
That correlation, if we had a system where people can't have access to porn, do you think the numbers would go down?
That's a very interesting question. It's a difficult one, isn't it? Because I'm not sure. It's very, very difficult. Hey, it's very possible that the numbers would go down, but of course, then it would just go underground, wouldn't it? And people would find illicit and illegal means of accessing it. And that could make the problem. It could potentially make it worse. But it's like also the solution is not to just let it be as it is either. I believe in Australia, they've started to stop kids. I think kids who are under 16 are not allowed smartphones.
3 weeks ago, they passed that 3 weeks ago, yeah.
That could help, especially to protect our kids. It's a sad thing when a patient calls, certainly when a parent calls me, Dr. Q, and says, I've just discovered that my son's who's 13, has been looking at pornography for 3 years. It's devastating for patients, for parents, should I say, because they just feel so defenseless, much like certainly women too. But what you can do is actually put blockers on your cell phone, on literally all your devices, and that can really help. And yes, many people get around them. That's true, yeah. But at least it can stall, in many ways, the compulsion to want to act out. Or he certainly put it off for a day.
But then you can do that. Put those blockers on your web browser or wherever. But then you've got another problem. You've got social media nowadays, and there you can easily access pornography. I was just having a conversation with a friend yesterday. He was there. And the gentleman was saying, he's in his 40s, and he was saying, why would you want to stop watching porn? Why would you want to stop masturbating? And he went as far as saying that, we don't even need the internet because Twitter porn is even more fun than what you get on the internet.
Well, that's an interesting question, isn't it? I mean, I think if you're in an exclusive relationship, then how fair is it to your partner that you're looking at porn? If you're not, that's your choice. Fine, no problem. That's absolutely your choice if you want to keep looking at pornography. But in the context of exclusivity in a relationship, to my mind, it's very important to abstain from porn. I know some couples like to look at it together, but if one of them's got a problem with porn, then it's just going to fuel the problems in the relationship and potentially their relationship. And I always use this word, Dr. Q, relationship with porn, relationship with sex. Sex addiction and pornography addiction is not about porn or sex. It's about your relationship with pornography and sex. Yeah.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, you are saying that if one does it in moderation, maybe I do it once a month, would it still qualify as a problem?
Completely depends on the person. Completely depends on the person. If you are vulnerable to addiction, and very often addiction is genetic, by the way, very often we've got family members, or it's also certainly mirrored to us. You know, I'm a huge believer that addiction is something that's mirrored and also genetic. So if you're vulnerable to addiction, then I would stay away from it because you may well be prone to developing a problem with it. There are certainly many people in this world who don't suffer from addiction, and maybe they can look at it. But it still concerns me in terms of the general overview of how society perceives and engages in terms of intimacy and healthy intimacy. Yeah. Because let's face it, you know, pornography is not exactly something that promotes healthy intimacy. Yeah. It's got a lot to do with to my mind, you know, power, sex, money. You know, that sort of famous triangle. You know, it's you've got to remember that when people start looking at pornography, what it does is it rearranges their sexual arousal template. And this is literally why I've had many women coming to me and saying to me, he doesn't want to have sex with me. And I look at them and say, well, I'm not surprised if he's been looking at porn for 5 years. He's trained his brain to only respond to sexual stimuli on a screen rather than you as his partner. Yeah, that's the problem with porn, is it rearranges our sexual arousal template. Yeah? And this is why I say that women can't compete with somebody who's stuck in an addiction to pornography. It's very, very difficult. Yeah, I do think in some way we need to at least be protecting our kids from it. Yeah, because they're the future, and if they're being subjected to porn at a young age, what does that say for the future of intimacy as a society?
And psychologically, what are the effects of pornography?
Well, I mean, too, like, you know, I've certainly noticed from having spoken to a few parents about their kids, stuff like they can't concentrate at school. I think there can be problems with sleep disturbance. You know, there's many consequences. I think, too, the other problem is they start to develop this very powerful fantasy world, sexual fantasy world, that's very obsessive. Now, all men fantasize. No, that's normal. But when you look at sex and porn addicts, they are very obsessive in their fantasies about sex. Yeah, it's like if a guy's walking down the street, Dr. Q, and he sees a nice girl and he says, "Wow, she's hot," you know. And he's moved on from her like 30 seconds, a minute later. I don't think we're dealing with somebody who's got a problem with sex addiction, yeah? But if a guy walks down the street and he looks at a girl and says, "Wow, she's hot," you know, and he starts obsessing about her as he walks away, he might even start following her, yeah? Then we have a problem. Can you see it's got so much to do with obsession and compulsion?
Yeah. But isn't that how I'm going to make reference to young men? Because I'm just thinking of myself when I was growing up. Teenagers would usually say that. They'd be like, "Dujin Domazan," and then they would follow the girl. And then they would start calling.
I think as teens, I mean, I absolutely hear you. I think that's normal. Yeah. But it's like, again, remember when we're dealing with addiction, especially a process addiction like porn or sex addiction, it's a problem that develops over time, over many years. Yeah. It doesn't just mean just because a teen starts chasing a girl that he's got a problem. We always have to remember that addiction is certainly something that takes many, many years to develop. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that the clinical world doesn't like to diagnose kids as addicts until they're at least 18 or more. Having said that, I can see clearly from some of the patients that I've treated in sort of pre-18 that they've clearly developed a problem with pornography use, with certainly addictive pornography use. But generally speaking, it's not good to diagnose kids with addiction until at least they're 18 or more.
But isn't that too late? If, say, for instance, my kid starts watching porn at the age of 12, 13, and it goes on until whenever, isn't it better to stop it earlier than to wait until they're 18?
Of course. And you make a very good point. It's I know that's the general rule of thumb, but it doesn't mean to say that people have developed, shall we say, have already developed a problem with porn even from the age of 12 up until 18. If they've been looking at it for 6 years, there's a good chance. The thing about addiction is it very much exists, really, Dr. Q, like all mental health, on a spectrum. Some people, I think, suffer from addiction more severely than others. But again, you've got to think about genetics too. I believe that we do have certainly addicts who are under 18. But having said that, like I said, generally speaking, there's a preference not to diagnose people with addiction until they're 18 or more.
Okay. Doctor, so Charlie, we've got a number of people that indicated that they've been wanting to stop masturbating, but they just can't stop. Why is that?
Tell me, are they masturbating with or without pornography?
They masturbate, they watch pornography. A majority of them watches pornography.
Okay. Look, it's a different one. It's a difficult one, isn't it, Doctor? Because Dr. Q, because I think certainly masturbation is a very normal part of actually growing up as a boy. But when you start throwing in pornography on a young developing mind, and it's that powerful and it delivers that strong a dopamine hit, then we're meddling with the brain and we're meddling with a child's development. Yeah. So I think, again, if there's an introduction to masturbation at a young age, again, when you look at porn addicts and sex addicts, they tend to have what we call a sexualized childhood. Now, again, kids are supposed to be kids. They're not supposed to be sexual beings until a certain age. Yeah. So that's a problem. We also live in a very sexualized society. I don't think that's helping either. And kids are sort of expected to, that there's pressure, I think, from society for kids to be more sort of older or more developed than they actually are or might be. I don't think pornography helps that at all, because what it's teaching kids is that this is literally normal sex. It's normal to be like, for example, engaged in sexual activity where shall we say, a man is dominating a woman with an enormous penis, and a woman with huge enhanced breasts. It's that's not living in the real world. That's why porn and fantasy is this lethal marriage. It's this lethal marriage. Yeah?
We've got people living in households where the parents and the kids are sharing rooms.
Yeah.
And in the middle of the night, what should happen between the mother and father. How does that contribute to this?
That's a very interesting question, because I've actually come across a few patients who've actually said as kids they could hear their parents being sexual. Yeah. And I think, again, depending on the child, it might have affected them in a certain way that it created some kind of curiosity, or they might have certainly developed problems with voyeurism, where we like to watch sex. It might even create problems, and I've known patients literally to hide out in cupboards and listen to couples being sexual. And you've always got to ask yourself, well, where did that come from? Where did that desire, that specific preference for that sexual behavior come from? And again, we have to look at trauma, because trauma is to my mind, is what ignites problems with sex and pornography addiction, specific to this addiction. Yeah. It could cause problems in answer to your question, Dr. Hugh, but it kind of depends on the individual. Again, we have to remember that we're all unique individuals, and we perceive things in different ways. And what might be okay for one child and water off a duck's back might be really damaging to another child. So it completely depends.
Do you know what I found interesting when I was conducting this survey? So one of the questions I asked was the age of the people that participated. And the majority of people that responded are people that I would think are in relationships. They're between ages 20 to 49.
Okay.
50 upwards and 13 to 19 constitute a smaller percentage. But these are the very same people that are so hooked on pornography. And when asked whether they would want to stop masturbating, many of them said yes. And but with a few that I had the privilege to engage with, they said, you know what, much as I said I want to, I'm not sure if I want to. There's that. But many of them also indicate that after they watch pornography and after they masturbate, they have this deep sense of regret.
Yeah.
So what causes that regret, number one? And number two, if I were to come to you and say, I am suffering from a porn addiction, how would you help me?
Okay. First and foremost, I think just talking about the masturbation aspect, again, when you look at people who develop a problem with pornography, like I've mentioned, pornography and masturbation just go hand in hand. They are literally it's like bread and butter. So what I would actually say to a pornography addict is you've also got to stop masturbating as well. Because if they suffer from addiction, they might say to themselves, well, I can't look at porn, but I can masturbate. Now, what if they are masturbation to fantasies of porn that they've looked at? Where do you think that's going to take them back to? Take them back to the porn.
Of course.
So that's why it's so important to address the pornography, the masturbation, and the fantasy. And I think it's very important. For example, one tool I give my patients is that when they start fantasizing, sexually fantasizing about wanting to act out, as we call it, sexually act out, and often sexual acting out has to do with soothing feelings. So I might resent my boss. My way of dealing with it is to sexualize my feelings by masturbating to porn. That might be something that I've learned to do from a young age. It's just become habit. It's become my way of dealing with my feelings. Addiction has all to do with escaping feelings and reality. So, I think I would strongly suggest that they not only stop looking at pornography, but they also stop masturbating too. So it's almost like they need to come into abstinence.
But if it was that easy, I think people would have stopped.
Yeah. If it was easy, you're right. If it was easy, they would have stopped. But that's why they come to me, because they can't stop. That's why they'll come to me and say. And very often, 95% of patients only come and see me when they get caught. 5% might come to me and say, I think I've got a problem. But to be honest, a very high proportion only come when their partners catch them. And there tends to be a pattern over many years where they've been caught. And sometimes their partner might give them an ultimatum, like either you get help or it's over. And sometimes we need that, I think in terms of treating certainly pornography and masturbation, the formula for recovery. So we call it recovery when you come suddenly into a place where you stop acting out. So you're either in addiction or you're in recovery, Dr. Q, yeah? So recovery entails a simple formula. Recovery from addiction is certainly, sorry, I'm just reminding myself here. A recovery equals abstinence, so I stop acting out, plus change.
Yeah.
Recovery doesn't equal abstinence. Because if I just abstain and I don't change the way I think and change the way I behave, what's going to happen? I'm going to go back. Because addiction is a progressive illness. If I don't confront it and admit to myself that I've got a problem, then it's just going to get worse. Yeah. It's a problem, I think, that also requires support groups as well. And I think certainly being with other people who struggle from the same problem too, I think strength in numbers can really help. And it's obviously too, we need to go into their past and look at their problems with trauma, how they've developed problems through trauma. Look at the way they've grown up in terms of the way their parents have mirrored intimacy to them, and give them tools and exercises to help raise their awareness. Our greatest weapon against addiction is self-awareness.
I really think it's not an easy thing to do. Once you get hooked, it's very hard to step out. And I say this because when I interact with people, gents in particular, and not ladies, they tell you, my guy, once you're in the thing, it's prison for life.
Really,
so it's either you accept it or you live in regret for the most part of your life. Because even if they are in relationships, they would say there's a point where you just want to do it yourself and you're not intimate with your partner.
That's why something you mentioned earlier that's really important to work with a porn addict is the shame, guilt and regret that they feel after they've acted out. Yeah? And that may be because they've promised themselves the last time they'd never do it again. And there's another sign of addiction, yeah. Years and years of repeated, broken, failed false promises. And there's that sense of hopelessness. I've done it again after a month. And that can be very soul-destroying and very upsetting. And a lot of people, I think, don't realize that there's help out there. There is help, but you've got to want to get better. You've got to want to stop. And sometimes that can mean a spouse saying, if you don't stop looking at porn, it's over. Sometimes we need that,
But what about people who get a sense of relief and they get excitement after doing it and they have no regret and they've been doing it for the past 15, 20 years?
Well, if that's what they enjoy doing and they have no desire often to be in a relationship, that's fine. That's their choice. I think you start to realize you've got a problem with addiction when it starts impacting on your life. So there's consequences, Dr. Q. That's key. You're starting to experience consequences for your behavior.
Interesting. Then you reference a lot of men. You reference a lot of boy children. What about girl children? What about women?
Very good question. I suspect that pornography, and I do get inquiries from women, very few, but I suspect that pornography is actually hugely underdiagnosed in women. And I think it's very difficult for them to come forward and to say, I've got a problem. Certainly when there's, shall we say, a double standard, that men must be the sexual species.
Yes.
So I suspect it is a problem amongst women, but it's most likely underdiagnosed. Yeah.
Interesting. So I have 9.3 females that responded here. By the way, you can work out the number. I got 75 in total. So everybody that participated here indicated that they masturbate. Literally everyone. Yeah. But then whenever we talk about masturbation and pornography, I've realized that women are usually left out. It's just men. And even in your studies, they talk about boys, they talk about men, they don't talk about women. It's like what you're saying, women have been underdiagnosed.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, what could be the issue? What's the contributing factor to that?
Well, I think, like I've said, I think it's very difficult for women to come forward and say, look, I think I've got a problem. I think it's shameful enough for men to do, but it's even harder for women because they're not expected to be the ones that should, shall we say, have this problem. Yeah, it should be men, but that's not true because addiction is prevalent in men and women. So who's to say that they can't also develop problems with it too? You know, it's just, I think it's very difficult for women to come forward because of the double standard and the deep degrees of shame. You know, it's not at all easy for them.
And if I am suffering from this type of addiction and I come to you, how long will it take for me to fully recover?
Completely depends. Completely depends on your desire to get better. I think we often talk in recovery about something called the gift of desperation, which ironically is an acronym for God. Because I do believe that we need in some way to have some kind of a relationship with God or a higher power, whatever you want to call it, something that's more powerful than the addiction. Because certainly many people say that addiction is a spiritual problem, it's spiritual bankruptcy. And that we need to lead a spiritual life to help us to get better. So it can completely depend, Dr. Q, on your desire to get better and just how much you're in touch with your consequences, yeah? Because the addiction will keep on taking from you. It doesn't care, yeah? This is what's so sad when you suffer from addiction is it's like having a split personality structure with, shall we say, a public life and a secret life. And it's like you're living a double life. Literally two lives, yeah. And I think certainly a lot of therapy is about merging or amalgamating those two lives together so that we're living a more authentic life. That's not to say we go and shout from the treetops, I'm a sex addict or I'm a porn addict, yeah. People don't need to know that, yeah. It's about getting into the right community of people who can help you to get better and stay sober, one day at a time.
So I'm a 13-year-old. I live in I'll say previously disadvantaged area. I don't have access to your services. What do I do? How would you advise me to step out of pornography? It's something I recently got introduced to as I stepped into teenagehood. How do I keep myself out of that trap?
Well, you're talking about a major problem, I think, in this country. We're talking about a major problem because there's no support for teenagers. And so any support that is available is not affordable to them. So to my mind, somewhere in time we need to start creating community support groups for teens who've got huge problems with porn. Because this is the thing is we can't confront this problem on our own. We need to confront it together. Yeah? And that's really, really key because there's no actual clinical support for teens who are struggling with pornography addiction. Yeah? It hasn't been thought. Well, I mean, it's to my knowledge, it's not available yet. But there's people who I work with who are creating a lot more awareness about pornography and how destructive it is. I think there's quite a campaign because, as I've said, it is an epidemic, not just in this country, but in the world.
Yeah. Damn. I think it all goes back to this easy access to the internet.
That's exactly the problem, Dr. Q.
Because I'm just thinking, when I was growing up, we used to go to the soccer fields. We used to do sports. We had things that kept us busy. And then if you look at, I'm not saying I'm that old, but if you look at today's kids, they are usually on their phones like this all the time.
That's the way society's going. We're becoming a society that relates to each other through screens rather than through speech and connection. No, or maybe eventually there'll be a backlash. Who knows? Who knows?
Hopefully,
I'm sure AI. AI will have something to say about that. But yeah.
Doug, Are you available online for people that would like to have a conversation with you but are not based in Johannesburg?
Sure. Basically, I have a website. I'm contactable via that website, and it's also got my phone on that website. So yeah.
Okay. Do you mind if we put them on our bio, just so whoever watches and listens can be able to get access to you if they need you?
Absolutely.
All
No
right.
problem.
Thank you so
My
much.
pleasure. It's a pleasure, Dr. Q.
Thank you very much. This has been very wonderful.
Good. I'm glad to hear it.
Much appreciated.
Pleasure.
Are we going back to square one, making fire?